Let me begin with a question that ought to shake us all. How does one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the entire world suddenly find itself running out of gasoline at home? How does the nation that for decades strutted across the global stage as an energy superpower face long lines at its gas stations and ordinary citizens asking, sometimes shouting, how this is even possible? The answer is not simply a matter of logistics or bad luck. It is a window into the deep contradictions of Russia's economy, its politics, and, yes, the very leadership of Vladimir Putin. Imagine, for just a moment, the absurdity of standing in line for hours at a gas station in a country that sits on vast oceans of oil and natural gas. It sounds almost like a cruel joke, doesn't it? And yet, this is the new reality for many ordinary Russians today. Russia, long hailed as an energy superpower, is now facing gasoline shortages on its own soil. This paradox is not just an inconvenience. It is a stunning indictment of the system that allowed it to happen, a system that exposes the deep contradictions at the heart of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The world sees Russia as the petrostate par excellence, the nation that has used oil and gas to flex its muscles on the global stage, blackmail Europe, and fund its war machine. But beneath that surface, something has cracked, and the effects are being felt at home in ways that no propaganda can easily cover up. The paradox is striking precisely because Russia's identity and global leverage have for decades been rooted in its energy dominance. Moscow's political narrative is built on the claim that Russia is strong because it controls energy. Oil and gas revenues have been the lifeblood of the Kremlin's budget, funding everything from pensions to infrastructure projects, and more recently, underwriting the enormous costs of the war in Ukraine. For years, Russians were told this is the price of stability, this is the foundation of strength. And yet, when people cannot find gasoline to drive their cars, when farmers cannot get fuel to run their equipment, that carefully crafted narrative begins to crumble. The irony is almost Shakespearean. Russia's greatest strength has now become the symbol of its internal weakness. To understand why, one has to look closely at the decisions made by the Russian leadership. Faced with unprecedented Western sanctions, Russia has been forced to lean even more heavily on its energy exports to generate the hard currency it desperately needs. Oil and gas shipped abroad bring in dollars and yuan, currencies that allow Russia to buy weapons, pay for imports, and keep the machinery of war turning. And so the government has prioritized exports, sending fuel out of the country while leaving its own citizens with shortages at home. This is not merely an economic miscalculation. It is a political choice. It is the choice to put war over welfare, empire over everyday life. And ordinary Russians see it for what it is. Now consider the psychological effect of this paradox. For decades, the Russian government has sold the image of Putin as the man who restored stability after the chaos of the 1990s. The leader who turned Russia's natural resources into national power. But when that very power fails to guarantee the basics, like gasoline for your car, the entire legitimacy of the regime is called into question. It is not about abstract economics anymore. It is about a father unable to drive his children to school, a worker unable to commute to their job, a farmer unable to transport goods to market. These daily disruptions pierce through propaganda in ways that speeches and television broadcasts cannot mend. And it is in this gap between official narrative and lived reality that anger begins to grow. This gasoline crisis, then, is more than just a technical supply issue. It is a window into the fragility of Putin's economic model. Russia has, for years, relied on a dangerous monoculture, an economy tethered overwhelmingly to oil and gas, vulnerable to price swings, sanctions, and logistical bottlenecks. When those lifelines are disrupted, the whole system shudders. And because the system is so centralized, politically, economically, and symbolically, those failures are inevitably tied to one man at the top. The paradox becomes personal, and the whispers of resignation become shouts in the street. What makes this moment so electrifying is that it forces Russians to confront the contradiction at the heart of their national story. They live in a land of extraordinary energy wealth, and yet they are told to wait, to sacrifice, to endure shortages as if they lived in a poor and struggling nation. That contradiction is not sustainable. It gnaws at the trust between ruler and ruled, it erodes the myth of invincibility, and it raises the question that so many are now daring to ask: if Russia cannot even provide gasoline for its people, what else can it no longer guarantee? Stability, security, a future. Those are the questions filling the silence in the gas lines, and those are the questions that may one day turn into demands for real change. Picture the scene: frustrated drivers sitting in cars that won't move, not because of traffic, but because there is no fuel to buy. The anger that begins in whispers, "How can this be happening here?" soon rises into chants. And then, something almost unthinkable in Russia begins to emerge. Voices not just complaining about gasoline, but calling for the resignation of Vladimir Putin himself. This is no longer about empty tanks. It is about the breaking of a political contract, the shattering of the myth that Putin is untouchable. What began as irritation at fuel shortages has turned into political defiance, and that shift is something Moscow cannot dismiss easily. The power of this moment lies in its symbolism. For years, the Kremlin's strength was built on the promise of stability. Russians were told that they might not have Western-style freedoms or prosperity, but under Putin they would at least have order, predictability, and a functioning system that shielded them from chaos. That was the bargain. But when people find themselves cooing at gas stations like it's the last days of the Soviet Union, when they see shortages in a country famous for its energy wealth, that promise feels broken. And once people believe their leaders cannot deliver on the basics, they begin to ask dangerous questions. They ask, why should we continue to accept this? Why should we stay silent? Why should we believe in a leader who has failed to keep his side of the deal? The demands for Putin's resignation, once unthinkable for ordinary citizens to voice, reveal just how far frustration has traveled. These are not the calls of fringe opposition figures alone. They are emerging from workers, farmers, drivers, and families who experience the shortages directly. When someone shouts, "Resign," at a rally or on social media today, it is not just an abstract political slogan. It is a cry born from lived reality. That is why it resonates. It is rooted in something every Russian can feel in their bones: the humiliation of living in an energy giant that cannot provide fuel for its people. That dissonance cuts deep, and it chips away at the fear that has long kept dissent silent. What makes this development so threatening to Putin is its contagious nature. Political discontent is like a spark in dry grass. It may start small, but once it catches, it spreads rapidly. A farmer unable to transport produce sees the same failure as a taxi driver unable to fill his tank. A mother stranded at home shares the same anger as a trucker stranded on the highway. And when they discover they are not alone, when they hear others daring to speak openly, a collective voice begins to form. This is how frustration becomes protest, and protest becomes movement. Russia has seen it before in its history, and the echoes are unmistakable. The Kremlin knows this, which is why it has always worked so hard to control the narrative. State television will downplay shortages, spokespeople will promise quick fixes, and officials will blame foreign sanctions or greedy middlemen. But propaganda has its limits. You cannot convince a driver that a gas station is full when he stares at an empty pump. You cannot tell a mother that her car will run on promises. When lived experience collides with state messaging, it is reality that wins. And in those collisions, trust erodes, leaving the government exposed. The shift from economic grievance to political anger is a dangerous one for any regime, but especially for one that has spent decades centralizing power in a single figure. In Russia today, Putin is not just the president, he is the system itself. Every failure, every shortage, every humiliation is tied to his name. That is why calls for resignation have such force. They strike at the core, at the very symbol of the state. And once such calls are spoken aloud, they are difficult to silence, because they resonate with the private doubts already sitting in millions of Russian minds. The gasoline crisis, then, has done more than inconvenience daily life. It has broken a psychological barrier. It has made it possible for Russians to imagine, perhaps for the first time in years, a future without Putin. That possibility, once taboo, once buried under fear, now sits in the open. And history shows that when people cross that threshold, when they move from silent frustration to public demand, regimes can weaken faster than anyone expects. The chants of "resign" may still be scattered, but they are growing louder. And with every passing day, they carry a truth that even the Kremlin cannot easily deny. Ask yourself this: what kind of government chooses to send its fuel abroad while its own citizens wait in lines at empty stations? What kind of leadership tells its people to endure sacrifice while it fills the pockets of exporters and oligarchs? This is the heart of Russia's gasoline crisis today, and it is not an accident of logistics or bad luck. It is the direct result of choices made at the very top, choices that prioritize exports over citizens, dollars over rubles, and war over welfare. For the Russian people, the humiliation of living in an energy-rich nation without access to gasoline is bad enough. But what makes it worse is the growing awareness that this is not just mismanagement. It is a conscious trade off, and they are the ones left paying the price. To grasp the magnitude of this betrayal, consider how the Russian economy functions under sanctions. Oil and gas are not just commodities for Russia, they are survival tools. With Western sanctions choking off access to financial markets, technologies, and trade, the Kremlin has turned even more aggressively to energy exports as its lifeline. Every barrel of oil sent abroad brings in hard currency, dollars, euros, yuan, that can be used to pay for weapons, imports, or to prop up state coffers. And so, in the eyes of the leadership, exporting fuel becomes more urgent than keeping domestic pumps supplied. The state's calculation is cold but simple. Better to let a driver in Siberia wait in line than to risk losing foreign revenues that sustain the regime. But the cruelty of that calculation is now becoming clear to ordinary Russians. They are starting to connect the dots. They see the government sending tankers of fuel abroad while they themselves cannot get to work. They see Moscow boast about record export revenues while rural towns run dry. They hear that exports are needed for the motherland's survival. But what survival means in practice is that the war machine continues while their daily lives collapse. This is how discontent is born, not just from shortages, but from the recognition that those shortages are imposed deliberately by a government that values foreign currency more than its own people's dignity. The symbolism of this choice is devastating. In a state that has built its legitimacy on the promise of strength and sovereignty, what could be weaker than depending on foreign markets for survival? What could be more humiliating than depriving your own citizens in order to appease global buyers? Russians are told that their sacrifices are noble, that shortages are the price of resisting Western aggression. But there is only so long that a population can swallow patriotic slogans when their own tanks are empty. And in that moment, when people begin to see the disconnect between the sacrifices demanded of them and the privileges enjoyed by the elites, faith in leadership unravels. History provides a sobering reminder here. Shortages have always carried political meaning in Russia. In 1917, it was bread. In the late Soviet years, it was consumer goods. Today, it is gasoline. And in each case, shortages were not just about scarcity. They revealed where power was being directed and whom the system truly served. When citizens realized they were being sacrificed for the sake of wars, elites, or imperial ambitions, their patience snapped. Gasoline shortages in 2025 now risk playing that same historical role. This is why the chants of resignation are growing louder. Russians know they are being told half-truths. They know that their suffering is not simply the result of sanctions, but the result of deliberate policy choices. They watch Putin's circle continue to enrich itself, even as they are told to endure. They see tankers leaving Russian ports filled with fuel while their own cars sit idle. These contradictions are too visible, too personal, too enraging to ignore, and so the anger is no longer about economics alone. It has become a moral indictment. To prioritize exports over citizens is to admit that loyalty flows upward, not downward. That the state does not exist to serve its people, but to use them. That realization is corrosive, and it cannot be reversed with quick fixes or propaganda. Once people believe that their government has chosen others over them, that trust is gone. And trust, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. So when Russians look at the empty pumps, they are not just seeing a temporary shortage. They are seeing the reflection of a political system that has abandoned them. They are seeing the cold calculus of a leadership that values power abroad more than justice at home. And they are beginning to ask the question that terrifies the Kremlin most. If our leaders will not put citizens first, why should citizens continue to put leaders first? That is the question burning silently in those gas lines, and it is a question that may reshape Russia's political future. Think about this. When citizens wait at empty pumps in a country drowning in oil, it is not just an economic failure. It is a symbol. Symbols matter in politics. They cut through the noise, they expose contradictions, and they crystallize anger in ways that statistics never could. Russia's gasoline shortage has now become exactly that, a symbol of a deeper crisis. It is no longer just about cars stranded on highways or farmers unable to move produce. It is about the collapse of a story the Kremlin has told for decades. The story was simple under Putin. Russia would be stable, strong, and immune to the chaos of the past. But when people see gasoline vanish from their daily lives, the symbol they read is entirely different. They see fragility where they were promised strength, neglect where they were promised care, and decay where they were promised stability. What makes symbols so powerful is how quickly they travel. Everyone in Russia understands the absurdity of fuel shortages in an energy-rich nation. They don't need economists or opposition figures to explain it. They can feel it in the inconvenience of waiting in line, in the embarrassment of borrowing rides, in the anger of losing workdays because they cannot drive. The symbol becomes universal, and because it touches so many different kinds of people, urban professionals, rural farmers, truckers, teachers, it cuts across divides. A symbol that unites frustration is far more dangerous to a regime than isolated complaints. Russia's history is full of such moments where scarcity became political shorthand for systemic failure. In 1917, bread lines in Petrograd were not simply about hunger, they were about the collapse of Tsarist promises. In the late 1980s, the empty shelves of Soviet stores were not simply about shortages, they were about the bankruptcy of a system that could not provide for its people. Today, gasoline lines carry the same weight. They say to Russians, your leaders cannot deliver what they promised. And when people internalize that message, no amount of state propaganda can fully erase it. The symbol sticks, and it gnaws at legitimacy. The power of this gasoline crisis lies in how it highlights the contradictions of Putin's model. On the one hand, Russia projects strength abroad through energy exports, pipelines, and geopolitical maneuvering. On the other hand, ordinary Russians face the humiliation of scarcity at home. The contradiction is too sharp, too glaring to ignore. It raises questions in every kitchen and workplace. How can the Kremlin boast of being an energy superpower while we can't even fill a tank? Those questions, repeated millions of times, erode confidence in leadership more than any speech from an opposition leader ever could. Symbols bypass ideology. They go straight to lived experience. And lived experience is precisely where the regime is weakest right now. Television can declare that everything is under control. Officials can blame sanctions, global markets, or mysterious saboteurs. But when the father cannot drive his child to the hospital, when the farmer cannot transport his goods, when the worker misses wages because buses and cars are stalled, no narrative can cover that over. The symbol of empty pumps becomes the daily proof that something is deeply wrong. That is why this crisis resonates so dangerously. The Russian people are not simply asking for gasoline, they are asking whether the system itself is broken. Every shortage plants doubt. Every delay fuels suspicion. Every explanation from above sounds thinner, weaker, less convincing. And the more the government insists it has everything under control, the more the symbol of gasoline lines whispers the opposite message. Control has slipped. There is also the matter of humiliation, a powerful driver in Russian political culture. To be denied what should be abundant, to suffer scarcity amid wealth, is humiliating. That humiliation does not fade easily. It lingers, it accumulates, and it transforms private frustration into public anger. Leaders ignore that emotional dimension at their peril because humiliation has toppled governments before. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of one single shortage. It collapsed because people were tired of the humiliation of being promised plenty and receiving nothing. Putin now risks facing the same dynamic. The gasoline shortage has crossed the line from problem to metaphor. It is no longer just about fuel. It is about the broken promises of an entire political order. And once people begin to see shortages as symbols, they start looking for what else in their lives carries that symbolic weight. Empty gas tanks can quickly become stand-ins for empty wallets, empty shelves, and empty futures. This is how a single crisis grows into a larger story, one that rulers cannot easily control. In Russia today, the pumps may be empty, but the meaning attached to that emptiness is overflowing. Imagine a government already under immense strain, weighed down by war, sanctions, and a restless population suddenly facing something as visible and infuriating as gasoline shortages. The timing could not be more dangerous for the Kremlin. Putin has built his reputation on the image of an unshakable leader, the one who would never allow Russia to descend into the uncertainty and humiliation of the 1990s. Yet now, amid a costly war in Ukraine, rising economic pressures, and increasing discontent across regions, the cracks are showing. Gasoline shortages are not isolated inconveniences. They are landing on top of a pile of frustrations already threatening to destabilize the regime. They have become a catalyst, an accelerant to a fire that was already smoldering. The pressures on Russian society today are extraordinary. The war in Ukraine continues to drain lives, resources, and attention with no clear end in sight. Young men are conscripted and sent to fight, leaving families fractured and communities hollowed out. Economic sanctions have cut off access to global markets, stunted investment, and made consumer goods more scarce or more expensive. Regional inequality has worsened, with Moscow and St. Petersburg insulated while poorer regions feel the brunt of shortages and inflation. On top of all this, hundreds of thousands of young, educated Russians have fled abroad in search of stability and opportunity, hollowing out the country's future workforce. These pressures alone would strain any government. Add fuel shortages to this already combustible environment, and you have the ingredients for serious instability. What makes this moment particularly volatile is how the gasoline crisis strikes directly at Putin's carefully curated image. For years, he has presented himself as the guarantor of stability, the man who restored order after the chaos of the post-Soviet collapse. Russians tolerated restrictions on democracy, corruption, and even economic stagnation in exchange for predictability and the sense that their basic needs would be met. But when even those basics begin to disappear, when filling a gas tank becomes a daily struggle, the foundation of Putin's legitimacy begins to erode. A leader can survive criticism of foreign policy or abstract corruption, but he cannot survive being blamed for empty pumps, stalled cars, and disrupted daily life. It is too personal, too immediate, too visible to spin away. And so, dissatisfaction that was once quiet, whispered in kitchens or hidden on encrypted apps, begins to surface in public. Gasoline lines create natural gathering points, places where people talk, share stories, and amplify each other's frustrations. That is where the spark of protest often begins. Not in opposition party headquarters, but in ordinary places where shared grievances come together. a farmer complaining about his tractors, a truck driver furious about lost wages, a nurse stranded without transport. These voices, once isolated, begin to harmonize into a chorus of discontent. When added to the sacrifices already demanded by war and sanctions, the outrage takes on a sharper, more dangerous edge. The Kremlin is well aware of this, which is why officials are scrambling to blame anyone but themselves. Foreign sanctions, greedy middlemen, logistical mishaps. But excuses cannot erase lived experience. Russians are not blind to the fact that tankers of fuel continue to leave the country for export, while they themselves wait in line. They see the disconnect between the government's priorities and their own lives. And the more the Kremlin insists that everything is under control, the more visible the loss of control becomes. It is a vicious cycle. The harder they try to maintain the image of stability, the more fragile that image looks. For Putin personally, this is a dangerous turning point. He has always thrived on projecting strength, both domestically and internationally. Yet gasoline shortages expose weakness, incompetence, and misplaced priorities. They remind people that behind the image of the Iron Man is a system that is failing to deliver. Once that realization spreads, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse. People can forgive leaders for being ruthless, even corrupt, so long as they deliver. But when they fail to deliver, when daily life becomes harder and more humiliating, the calculus changes. Loyalty weakens, patience thins, and the whispers of discontent become louder. This is why the gasoline crisis cannot be dismissed as temporary. It lands at a time when Russia is already wobbling under the weight of war, sanctions, regional unrest, and demographic decline. It compounds the grievances that were already building, turning them from private frustrations into public anger. And in the process, it threatens the one thing Putin has relied on most, the perception that he is untouchable. When people see that the system is failing at its most basic tasks, they begin to imagine alternatives. And once alternatives are imagined, even in quiet conversations, the path to change begins to open. Ask yourself what history teaches us. Can any government truly survive when it stops providing for its own people? Can a regime maintain its legitimacy when the very basics of daily life become symbols of its failure? Russia's current gasoline shortage is not just a hiccup in supply, it is part of a larger story with profound global and historical implications. This is not simply about fuel, nor is it only about frustration at empty pumps. It is about what happens when a system prioritizes power, exports, and empire over the needs of ordinary citizens. And history has a long record of showing how such choices unravel even the mightiest regimes. The first global implication is that Russia's energy crisis reveals a vulnerability few outside the Kremlin ever expected. For decades, Moscow has wielded oil and gas as weapons of influence. Europe once trembled at the thought of Russia shutting off pipelines. Energy was the tool that bought alliances, built leverage, and filled the Kremlin's coffers. But now the world sees the other side of that coin. The same country that can intimidate its neighbors with energy exports cannot keep its own citizens fueled. That contradiction weakens not only Russia's image abroad, but also its bargaining power. Who will fear an energy superpower that cannot supply its own people? The perception of strength, once central to Putin's foreign policy, begins to erode. Historically, moments like this have marked turning points for great powers. The British Empire faltered when it could no longer provide economic stability at home. The Soviet Union unraveled not on the battlefield, but in the daily frustrations of empty shelves and broken promises. When ordinary life becomes unbearable, when shortages carry political meaning, regimes collapse from within. Russia's gasoline shortage belongs to this same lineage. It has become a symbol of deeper systemic decay, and symbols have always been the sparks that ignite transformation. What makes this moment particularly volatile is how it intersects with the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has demanded enormous sacrifices from its people in the name of national strength and patriotic duty. But what happens when those sacrifices no longer feel noble, when they feel like exploitation? When mothers see their sons sent to war and also